Welcome to The Golden Shadow, the podcast about psychology, philosophy, myth, mysticism, and mystery. My name is Alyssa Polizzi.
And I'm Aaron Rogerson.
And today we're talking about the concepts of virtue and vice. So, Aaron, how do we define these concepts?
Virtue and vice, very old concepts that have been discussed for thousands of years, if not more than that. To put it simply, when we talk about virtue, we are talking about something that we consider to be good. That's the simplest way to put it. Vice is something that we consider to be bad. Usually we're referring to traits or behaviors, characteristics, ways of being. Someone who does what we consider to be a good job or exhibits good behavior or has a great accomplishment that we consider positive, we call them virtuous.
Yeah.
Someone who has bad habits, someone we don't like being around us, someone we find to be difficult to work with, all kinds of things you could think of that we would consider to be negative. We call this vice. And so today we're trying to explore what do we mean by these concepts and how can we really identify what is virtue, what is vice, and how do we aim perhaps to become more virtuous.
So, why did we pick this topic?
Well, last week we were talking about the big 5 personality traits. And just to remind the audience, this is the acronym OCEAN, which refers to openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism.
Yeah.
And then we broke those traits down into sub-traits. But each trait is scored on a percentile, with 0% meaning in conscientiousness, 0% would mean you are less conscientious than the entire population, and 100% would mean that you are more conscientious than the entire population, and 50% in conscientiousness would mean that you are average.
Yeah.
But what's important to illustrate is that a 100% score is not simply good, and a 0% score is not simply bad. That what we're really looking for in our personality traits and the way that we reconcile different traits with each other is balance.
Right.
And that's what we're trying to get into today.
Yeah, we kind of touched on this in episode 9 with the big 5, and especially with the way that that system is designed, you might, if you had a very sort of low resolution understanding of it, think the higher the better, right? 80% plus, like, yeah, I'm doing great. 80% agreeableness, 90% agreeableness. When you start to actually contextualize that and frame it against real life, we start to realize that seemingly virtuous qualities can become kind of pathological.
Right.
When,
if they're excessive.
Yeah.
And the valence of traits is what we're trying to get into today. And valence is the term used in psychology to describe the value assigned to a phenomenon.
Yeah.
Like good or bad. Does it feel good or does it feel bad? That's the valence. And in this context, we're using it to describe traits. Is at what point does this trait, courage, let's say, at what point does courage become excessive and become a vice?
Right.
At what point does courage become deficient and become a vice?
Yeah.
And that's the important thing to understand here that's a little bit counterintuitive is, well, courage is always good, right?
Right.
But it's not, and we recognize this. If you are excessively courageous, we might call you reckless, or we might even call you stupid, because you might believe that you should step forward and take charge of something that you are actually not capable of taking charge of.
Right.
And you hurt yourself.
Yeah.
And we say, well, that was stupid.
Right.
That wasn't brave. That was just dumb.
Yeah.
And similarly, if someone is a coward,
Yeah.
that's more obvious. We say you're deficient in courage.
Yeah.
And we say that is also vice.
Yeah.
So too courageous, vice.
Right.
Not courageous enough, vice.
Right.
So virtue points to something that's in the middle.
Right. And I think even within the framework of the big 5, we start to see how all of these major traits interplay into each other. Because if you're kind of moving off that sort of middle ground where things are in balance, maybe you score high in a certain trait, but maybe another trait kind of supplements that extremeness. And so it's important to think about these different traits that you have, whether you're looking at it through the big five or just kind of writing down your own strengths. You know, where do these interplay with the other aspects of your personality? If you're highly courageous, you know, maybe having a little bit of that neuroticism factor makes you second guess and actually consider what might go wrong. And that pause, that moment to think things through can save you from doing something incredibly stupid.
Right. So it's not just balance within one trait,
Yeah.
like a balance of courage. What's the balanced level of courage? But it's also balancing all traits together, reconciling all traits.
Yes.
And that's something we tapped into with the last episode with the big five, is that all of these traits are interwoven, interacting. They blur into one another. It's not clear where one ends and the other begins.
Yeah.
And it's not even clear that all the traits really map out all of the totality of one's self.
Yeah,
It's hard to say.
Certainly not.
But when you have a trait like extroversion, which is one of the big five, and another trait, assertiveness.
Yeah.
Sorry, assertiveness is a subtrait of extroversion. And
Yeah.
if you combine that with agreeableness, which is a different trait, someone who is very assertive, you could say it's a positive thing.
Yeah.
Someone who takes charge, someone who puts their ideas forward, someone who wants to help make sure a social situation achieves its goals,
Right.
or helps a work situation, a team
Yeah.
at work achieve its goals. Someone who puts themselves forward and takes charge, that's virtuous. But if someone is excessively assertive, they might be really difficult to work with because they're constantly trying to put their foot forward, and they want to be in charge and they want to lead, and they're always aggressively locking into what it is they think they need, or what the group needs.
Yeah.
But that person can be sort of extreme, and if you combine that with a trait, let's say agreeableness, and it's very low, if you're
Right.
very disagreeable
Yeah.
and very assertive at the same time, this is the kind of individual that is very uncooperative and yet wants to get their way.
Yeah.
And the more extreme those traits are, the more assertive you are, the more extreme that is, combined with the more extremely disagreeable you are, you get more and more to this realm of vice.
Yeah.
What we recognize as being, this is not a person that we want to have around.
Right.
And so balancing these traits together and finding the middle point, finding the place just like on a bicycle where you're not too far and you're not too left. Sorry, you're not too far left and you're not too far right.
Yeah.
You're balanced. And when you're
Yeah.
balanced, you can go, you
Yeah.
can move forward, and you can get the things you want. That's really what virtue is. And that's really what we mean when we talk about valence.
Yeah.
Something is good when it's balanced,
Right.
and something is bad when it's unbalanced.
Yeah. It kind of strikes me that someone could very easily get themselves sort of like wrapped up into looking at a situation saying, well, I'm doing the right thing. You can look and kind of internally take stock of, well, I'm being strong, or I am being compassionate, or I am, doing what's best for the group. But when you look at those things within a vacuum, and you don't sort of take the subjectivity factor out of it and consider the greater environment, or that maybe in one case where your agreeableness is actually appropriate, it's totally not appropriate in another place. And so it requires then this flexibility of personality and flexibility of the choices that you make, and needing to sort of move through situations or interactions with people, knowing that you need to adjust and you need to kind of compensate sometimes, like, because wherever that middle is constantly changing.
Yeah. And it depends on the situation, the conditions, as you're saying. So one trait, a certain level of a trait, let's say you have a level of agreeableness, how cooperative you are, how willing you are to be obedient, how willing you are to help someone else get what they need in a given situation. Agreeableness, that might be what we'd say virtuous. We might say that's good to be agreeable in a friendship. For instance, if the relationship is friendly, it's someone that you care about, it's good to cooperate with your friends. It's good to care about their needs. It's good to cater to what they need. We'd say usually this is virtuous. And obviously that can get excessive, and we can get into that. But what if we take a different situation, the same level of agreeableness, let's say, in a job situation, especially let's say if you're working with the public, it can be more complicated.
Yeah.
You can't be completely agreeable if you work with the public. For instance, if you've worked as a bartender like I have, this is speaking from personal experience, there's a different balance that comes with being cooperative with people as a bartender than when you're hanging out with your friends.
Yeah.
And if you're too agreeable as a bartender, people will take advantage of you. People will do things like not pay. People will do things like not tip. Some people will try to coax you into giving them more alcohol than they paid for by appealing to your kindness, or trying to trick you into saying you didn't pour enough into my drink. Things like that. And you find if you're a bartender that you really need to kind of shut people down and be an authority and lay down the law. And this requires disagreeableness. And so the context shifts. And at one moment, this trait, agreeableness, is virtuous. And then in another situation, when you're bartending, this trait of agreeableness can become a vice.
Right.
And that's what's so interesting, is you're finding these balances in all situations, in all relationships, in different stages of your life as you grow older and you enter a new phase where you go from being a bachelor, let's say, to being a parent. These traits that maybe were virtuous when you were 15 are no longer virtuous when you're 30.
Yeah.
And that's this constant recalibration of one's life.
So to further illustrate this point, we are going to draw at random some archetype cards. You might remember them from our episode on archetypes. Each of these cards holds some details about the shadow and light attributes. So one might relate that to this sort of vice and virtue that is nested underneath the major archetype. So go ahead, Aaron, draw an archetype card.
Yeah, so these cards are interesting because they mostly list things that we consider to be virtuous. And the light side of the card is exploring the virtuous manifestation of this trait or this archetype or this way of being. And the shadow side is tapping into this notion of excess, the possibility for what we think is a virtuous trait to become vice, purely by becoming too much. So some of these might be kind of weird. We're pulling these at random. We haven't really rehearsed this at all. So the card I pulled is Mother.
Ooh, okay.
So if we think of being mothering,
Yeah.
being a mother as being something that we consider to be virtuous,
Yes.
which I think is pretty universal.
Yeah, there's nurturance. There's this life-giving quality to it. Something that kind of holds and sustains a creation of something, of some form.
Right, the force that creates the world,
Yeah.
basically, that births
Yeah.
the world and raises it up to a place of strength. And it's very powerful when we think about it that way.
Yeah, yeah.
So the light side of this, the virtuous side of being a mother, the card reads nurturance, patience, unconditional love, joy in giving birth to life. So everything we just said.
Yeah.
Virtuous, good. Being a mother is good.
Yeah.
We need mothers.
Yes.
But you could be overly mothering,
Yeah.
let's say, and that's what these cards kind of tap into, which is interesting.
Yes.
So if you are an excessive embodiment of being a mother, you might get into the shadow attributes, which read on this card: smothering or abandoning
Yeah.
children,
Yeah.
instilling guilt in children for becoming independent.
Ooh, yeah.
Right, and so this is a real thing
Yeah.
that we see manifested.
Yeah.
This notion of smothering, spoiling,
Yeah.
overprotection. Mothers need to allow their children to grow, and as they grow, to leave the nest.
Yes. Yeah.
And so it's possible to be overly motherly, where you are preventing someone from leaving the nest and becoming independent.
Yeah. It's highly important to the development of an individual that they can differentiate from the parental unit, which requires that which from where they came from, which is the mother, can be seen as separate and not just in this really obvious way of like, I need to leave home, I need to get my own apartment, I need to go to college. Emotionally, oh, that's such a big thing to me as well, because sometimes we can still be so dependent on that nurturance that we fail to sort of lift off into our own power and become our own sort of self-soothing individual, that you can generate that energy. And not to say that one dismisses the mother or totally cuts it out of their life, but it's important for the development of the individual to break free of that archetypal paradigm.
Right. Another aspect of this is it's possible to be overly self-sacrificial as a mother. So part of the virtuous side of this card is unconditional love.
Right.
You could give yourself away
Yeah, too much.
too much.
Yeah.
You could exhaust yourself.
Yeah.
A mother could deplete herself in loving her child and get to a place where she is weakened and collapses and can no longer do her tasks effectively because she's given too much of herself away.
Yeah.
And so the mother needs to find a balance in this nurturing, patient, loving role.
Yeah.
And if you don't do that, you can't be a good mother.
I like that this one also includes the abandonment, which is kind of like it's like the other side of the valence spectrum.
Right. Good. Yeah. Deficiency.
Deficiency.
Right.
Thank you. Yeah. That is where like the mother has acquiesced all of her responsibilities. She's disconnected from that archetype, and man, destruction usually comes in its path.
Right.
All right.
Okay. Alyssa's going to pick a card now.
Here we go. The Judge.
The Judge.
Yes.
Okay.
The imagery shows an individual with the scales of justice, light attributes, balancing justice and compassion, managing the fair distribution of power. So,
Fairness.
fairness, yeah.
You could say the judge is sort of the arbiter of fairness, and we consider what is fair to be good, usually.
Yes.
We consider people who are fair to be virtuous. So clearly being, this one's I think a little more intuitive, but clearly being a judge, you can be a good judge
Yes.
by making sure everyone gets what they are owed and making sure that people play by the rules,
Yeah.
providing a structure.
Yeah.
And almost actually in like it has kind of like this fatherly
Yeah.
position, which
Sure.
is interesting
Sure.
in contrast to the mother, which we just drew. But there's a good way to be someone who judges.
Yeah.
But of course, as we really talk about pretty often, there's a bad way to be judging.
Oh, absolutely. And here we have for the shadow attribute that offering only destructive criticism or misusing business, legal, or criminal authority. So one who is in power, one who has the status of the judge, as an example,
Yeah.
that power can corrupt. Your morals could be corrupted and very quickly can spiral into that space of vice where it's being misused. Because to me, man, especially like with the judge, I'm reminded a lot of like the principle of justice, that kind of tarot card where it's like this is the universal principle of equality that does not really take the dynamic of, you know, the deeply emotional personal situation into account, but is judging based on truly what is right. And in that way, when the hammer comes down or when the sword swings, what's happening is that it might be difficult, but man, it's compassionate because there's probably a lesson there. So sometimes that judgment feels harsh,
Yeah.
but it's so needed.
Right. So people who feel judged are often perceiving judgment as being a vice.
No, yeah.
And that's what it alludes to, the shadow side of being judgmental, let's say, is like
Yeah.
you're being destructive in your judgment, or you're being
Yeah.
overly harsh and it's not helpful, or you're making me feel insecure, self-conscious, and like
Yes.
that. I don't find that helpful. And that's how it feels a lot of the time. But it's also important to acknowledge the deficiency vice
Yeah.
with the judge is if you are someone who is observing a lack of fairness around you, or you're perceiving someone who you think is not behaving appropriately,
Yeah.
it's virtuous to speak up. It's virtuous to make your feelings clear that, like, you know,
Yeah.
I think that you're kind of out of line here, and I think maybe you need to check yourself, or I think maybe you need to do a better job. And again, this is kind of counterintuitive, but, you know, you can be deficient in judging people, and then there's no one has any feedback.
Yeah.
You're not honest about how you feel.
Mm-hmm.
You might refrain from speaking your mind to your friends,
Yeah.
or in your romantic relationship. You might feel something's out of line, and you say nothing because you think it's virtuous to say nothing.
Yeah.
But it isn't all the
Right.
time.
Or maybe you even lack the belief in that what you think is worth saying and worth expressing, and despite maybe it being true that what you have to offer, the judgment, as one might say, that might come forward, might be difficult for someone to hear. The fact of the matter is, it could change something meaningfully, and that judgment often is meant to come to bring things back to order. And so that deficiency might come from you even like lacking the quality to be able to value what it is that you have to offer to another individual or to a situation. And that's unfortunate in my opinion.
Okay, next card.
All right.
I'm picking. This is interesting, actually. Yeah, these cards are good because
Okay.
it's definitely pushing us to explore ideas I don't think we would otherwise. But the card I got is the Thief,
Ooh, okay.
and this is good because you might think, well, how could a thief be virtuous?
Certainly.
How is that possible?
Yes.
So we'll try and explore this and find
Yes.
out. The light attribute of this, the virtuous attribute, let's say, is sheds light on the potential wealth within you that can never be stolen. That's pretty out there. So this is saying the light attribute is that you can never be robbed. This doesn't really work for what we're talking
Okay,
about. very well.
let me tell you what I think what
Okay.
came to mind, because
Okay.
immediately this is funny, but no, immediately my mind went to the archetypal god, who the patron saint of thieves, Hermes himself. So there's this quickness to him. There's this
Yeah.
mercurial nature of sort of like hidden in the shadows, coming out, transformation, transmutation.
Right.
And when we think about one who can sort of slip into these places, I know that's kind of what I'm tapping into visually with
No, this is
this,
good.
with the thief. I sense that what brings balance there is the ability to lose that rigidity and to kind of go in a way that might seem a little questionable, but
Right.
sometimes we really need to like break whatever framework that we're in, and archetypally, Hermes is very much associated with that. I think that's why he was also adopted into the alchemical tradition and really seen as the kind of patron saint of alchemy.
Yeah.
Because we need that core to be able to move and blend and shift and transform. And so to me, that's the archetype of the thief.
Right. So someone who is lurking in the shadows,
Covert, yes.
hidden,
Yeah.
operating in ways that are, again, sneaky, sly.
Yeah. But like keeping your cards to yourself, right? You haven't revealed
Right.
your hand.
Right. So that can definitely be virtuous. It's important to be able to move in this way
Yeah.
in the world. Sometimes you need to kind of lurk in the shadows. Sometimes you need to go under cover of darkness
Yeah.
in some sense to play with an idea you have, or
Yeah.
explore something, or
Yeah.
feel protected as if no one is watching.
Yeah.
Embracing this kind of attitude of I'm hidden and alone. We can try the shadow attribute of this. So how might you be a thief that is embodying vice? And this is a little more obvious,
Yeah.
I think. But it says stealing money, stealing creative ideas,
Okay.
stealing affection.
Ooh.
Which is
Wow.
interesting. or other powers you think you lack. So yeah, this is pretty, again, pretty psychedelic card, I feel like, as far as what this is tapping into. But how would you interpret that? Stealing affection, what does that mean?
Man, I'm thinking of manipulation, I guess,
yeah.
is where my mind went when I heard that. Just like, oh, that's loaded. But someone who really knows how to sneak their way into a situation or use sleight of tongue, hidden words, subtle influence
Yeah.
to kind of rope a situation to going a certain way or to steal the affection of somebody, maybe because they just want it and they don't actually care that much. That seems pretty shadowy to me.
Yeah, there's also the archetype of like Robin Hood, I think, which is like the hero thief.
Yes.
Which I think is another aspect of this is that it's possible that we could view stealing as being okay or being good.
Yes.
As
Robin Hood,
redistributing wealth
Yes.
or making sure things are fair.
Yeah.
If something's being withheld from someone who needs it.
Yeah.
So that's another aspect of this. That's a bigger conversation, though. Let's try another card.
All right, one more. The femme fatale.
The femme fatale. Okay, this should be interesting.
All right, so we are looking at the light attributes as someone who highlights the erotic energy of the feminine, opens your heart when your dependency is rejected. What do you think, Oren?
Read it again.
Highlights the erotic energy of the feminine, opens your heart when your dependency is rejected.
Well, if this is tapping into feminine sexuality,
sure,
in some sense,
initially,
this is, I don't know, this is kind of a charged topic to explore, maybe, but we'll do it anyways. I think we have a pretty established conversation about the way that male sexuality can become vice. I think we talk a little bit less about how female sexuality can be vice.
Yeah.
But the feminine principle is one of passive receptive,
sure,
sort of letting things come to you.
Yeah.
Operating more in the unconscious realm. As far as romantic interaction goes, the feminine energy, and again, this doesn't necessarily speak to females specifically, as much as it speaks to this sort of notion of feminine energy,
yes,
which is present in both sexes. But letting things come to you, operating in a sort of like unconscious, more sort of hidden way, one that's a little more sort of intuitive, less rational.
Yeah.
That kind of energy can lead to manipulation.
Yeah.
The kind of stereotypical being led on that males often experience or report, at least. They feel as if they're being led on. They think something romantic is happening, but it's not actually happening. Again, this is slightly controversial, but definitely women are capable of using their sexuality to go what they want.
Yeah, certainly.
And to manipulate situations to go the way they want. And they have no intention of having a romantic relationship or even having a romantic interaction or even a sexual interaction at all. But they can wield their feminine sexuality to sort of turn the energy towards getting what they want in a way that men find more difficult to do.
Right, because the general masculine version of that is a much more kind of active, powerful principle where one is sort of taking control of a situation or authority or something like that. We're just dealing with very different sort of universal principles of expression of power and a sort of influence. And so this feminine principle is about tapping into something that's a little bit more subtle. And with that comes the seduction, right? That kind of like oozes off the feminine archetype in that way. And it's like, whoa, I'm getting hooked in versus like the masculine principle is like loud and obvious and you're drawn to it kind of like, a moth to a flame or something like that. So the feminine principle is certainly tapping into that often sexual energy to express that because it is part of the experience as the life energy that we all have access to, that libido obviously known in its very obvious sexual form,
Yeah.
it contains other aspects, but at the same time, that sexual energy is potent. We think about it a lot in our society. So much of our culture is based around sex appeal, sexual relations, romantic relationships. It's just a core part of who we are.
Yeah, I mean, you could say all of human behavior is actually focused around sex,
Yeah.
depending on how you look at it. But it's clearly something we consider to be sacred in a very serious way,
Yeah.
even though that wording might seem strange to people.
Yeah.
But it's true. We really have sex as this very flashy, very core thing that we're constantly circumambulating, kind of circling around it.
Yeah.
Always there.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's always tension there with sex.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of work to get to a place where you're not gravitating around sex, I would say.
To sort of continue to flesh this out, I feel like the femme fatale allows an expression, especially for women, to feel comfortable in themselves, which is inherently then your physical beauty or your inner power or inner beauty. It's this deeply expressive act of your nature and your spirit. And because to me, it's like the femme fatale isn't really who she is unless she's deeply grounded in her being, that she's courageous in her expression. And that makes an individual like sexy, that makes an individual seem compelling and interesting. And sort of like anecdotally speaking, I feel like in recent year or so, I've had what I've written down in my dream journal as femme fatale dreams, which I'm not necessarily going in there and just like knocking heads and like wooing men necessarily, but there is this undercurrent of like feminine sort of power and comfort that I feel in this dream. And they're not just like centered around sex or something like that.
Right.
Although I'm moving through these sort of dream scenes with this sense of that, whatever that femme fatale is. So to me, I think it's an expression of a powerful woman. And I think that yes, it highlights that sort of erotic feminine and the sexual feminine. But her ability to kind of like come in and own a room has a lot to do with it, with more than just the sexual nature as well.
Right. Sex is definitely more than just pee in the vagina, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it really leaks into what our behaviors.
Yeah.
And dancing is sexual.
Oh, yeah.
And having, excuse me, conversations can be very sexual.
Yeah.
In the sense of sort of this interpenetration of personality.
Yeah.
Which is why, people often consider someone to be cheating on them just by talking to someone else. And
Right.
so sex is much bigger than just this biological, physical thing happening.
Yeah. The shadow attributes on this card speak to the inappropriate use of sensuality or attachment to money and power. And at least with the aspect of the inappropriate use of sensuality, I think you were kind of touching upon that a little bit. And I think it's part of the power of the feminine principle to feel sensual, to feel connected, to feel seen. And we get that in its most platonic form through the mother, as we talked about earlier. But that develops and informs how we connect to the feminine principle in different ways. And so when the femme fatale is using this in a way to connect to other individuals, and they understand the power and influence that comes from someone feeling seen and heard, and that sensual sort of connection, which might not really pass the threshold of an erotic nature, it still can really mess people up. So that kind of aspect of the shadow of the femme fatale is just like, she needs to be careful how she wields that. She needs to be careful of the impact it has when she connects to another person, because it can really give the wrong impression.
Yeah. And again, that what you just said speaks again to the idea of the balance.
Right.
This energy, is it good or bad? It's
Right.
like, well, it's neither. It's how do you wield it?
Right.
You want to wield it in a balanced way.
Yeah.
This could be a much bigger conversation. Maybe we need to do a podcast episode on sexuality.
Definitely.
Of the feminine and the masculine. I think it'd be interesting.
Yeah, it would.
And appropriate for our current era, you might say. Let's do another card.
Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
These last two have been very interesting, but they've also been maybe a little more abstract. This is interesting. Okay, liberator.
Ooh.
So someone who liberates sounds virtuous, right?
Certainly does.
Sounds like a good thing. Someone who frees people, someone who provides power and agency to other individuals.
Yeah.
The light attributes on this card are freeing yourself and others from outmoded beliefs. Which is an interesting way to phrase it. Releasing negative thought patterns. So again, freedom, freeing yourself, freeing others, being someone who lifts others up to a place of agency and power so they can actually get what they want, so they can be people, so they can be adults.
Yeah.
And that can happen in a very explicit physical way. You could break someone free, literally out of shackles, and free them, or you might have a friend that you help empower to get to a place where they become more independent and can live their life in a beneficial way.
Yeah.
So that's all pretty intuitive. The shadow attributes of this card, how the liberator might become a vice, let's say. Imposing your own tyranny over those you claim to liberate, and ignoring legitimate constraints.
Wow. That's heavy.
That's heavy.
That's heavy.
The imposing your own tyranny over those you claim to liberate is sort of embodying a false liberator.
Yeah. Yeah.
Taking the mantle of liberator and misusing it and pretending as if you are freeing people when in fact you are doing the opposite.
Yeah, I'm like thinking a lot of like cult leaders. That's
Right.
what comes to mind,
Yeah.
right? It's
Yeah.
like this person is walking around with some sort of narrative, and man, that's like really key to like that archetypal power is the narrative that everybody has bought into. And in this case, it's like spiritual liberation often. Liberation from the material world, you know, it's always like coded in some sort of like kind of I don't know, like trans-dimensional dynamic. I think when we start to deal with like the cult leader, because it's some way for you to break out of this earthly existence. And you throw so much of your agency and power away. You give it to this liberator, and then what happens? Well, they're basically a false god,
Yeah.
and often it ends in disaster. Sometimes death, sometimes like extreme abuse, things like that. So
There's a very historical way to look at this idea too, which is that the revolution, that's like freedom, and there's plenty of examples throughout history of revolutions happening, which happen under the pretext that we are freeing the people, let's say, but revolutions are often followed by a reign of terror, or they're followed by breaking free of your let's say constraints, the things that are holding you down, the things that are oppressing you, let's say, but that leads to this chaos that you were not anticipating, that actually leads to less freedom because you return to a place of war and bloodshed, and you can go backwards just as far as like technology, quality of life. The communist revolutions, I would say, kind of speak to this of freeing the people, but then arriving in some place that's actually less free. So that's a more complex thing to unpack, I think, but that's where my instinct goes. I think the second part of this I find interesting, which is more generalized, this sort of excessive liberation is ignoring legitimate constraints. So the liberator breaks away the order to free people. But you can naively believe that any order is bad because it constrains you. And so you break the order down and you free yourself of it. And that actually just leads to chaos.
Anarchy.
Right.
Even in the sense when I think the ideals are coming from this like utopic mindset, there's like a reason utopias don't exist. This
Right.
idea that we can liberate ourselves from how money controls us, how government controls us, relationship dynamics, how those like, let's just be free.
Yeah.
Let's just have everything be open.
Right. It's so obvious.
Right.
Why don't we just be free? Like,
Yeah.
life would be better for everyone.
Right.
And that's ignoring that structure provides protection,
Yeah.
provides
Yeah.
the ability to achieve goals that otherwise
Mm.
wouldn't be there. It's like building a railway system or a road. It's like this is ordering your environment, but think of all the things you
Mm-hmm. Right.
can do with a road.
Yes.
Think of all the places you can go.
Yeah.
And the idea of like, well, the road is order. Let's just destroy it.
Right.
So you can't get anywhere now. And so
Yeah.
so there is this interaction of freedom and chaos sort of kind of going together, and order and tyranny kind of going together.
Yeah.
This is speaking to, and the liberator needs to be careful and find a balance in that
Yeah.
and not be deficient or excessive. Now it's time for a question from the audience. This is from Julio. What do you think of lucid dreaming? You talked about our ego not being part of our dreams. So what is the me that controls the dream? Can this type of dream be analyzed the same way as normal dreams?
Great question. And I think this brings up something probably people do feel confused about, because we recognize in dreams that the me, the ego that we interact with on the everyday waking life, is certainly not present in dreams. You do not have the same autonomy, the same power, the same awareness. So often, especially from the sort of depth psychology lens, we consider that the you that is in the dream is the dream ego. So it's like a variation of the you that you know when you wake up every morning. It
Right, so
helps
this
continue that continuity.
Right, so this is he's saying that we said there was no ego in the dream, and he's alluding to the dreams episode in
Yes.
which we discussed what dreams were, or speculated what dreams were, you might
Yeah.
say. And we made the point that the ego, the autobiographical I,
Yeah.
the thing that thinks it's in charge, the thing that's sort of like experiencing waking life
Yeah.
in some way, that sort of dissipates.
Yeah.
In dreams, and the unconscious is allowed to sort of take over, but not completely.
Yeah,
Right.
definitely.
And it's interesting because he makes a good point. The lucid dreaming, there is still an I.
Yeah.
It's still autobiographical.
Yes.
And you are navigating reality.
Yeah.
Your dream reality.
Yeah.
But it's not quite the same.
No.
Lucid dreaming is never really the same as waking life. Of
Yeah.
Just, the way it might be depicted in like a movie or
Yeah.
something like that, where you can't tell which is real and what's not
Right.
real. It's like, no, it's like dreams just qualitatively are very different than waking life.
Yeah, and I think that you can differentiate, the ego that's present in dreams versus the one that's alive in everyday life. Because if you're dreaming about being, on a mountain in Peru, you're not like, "Hoy, hold on, I went to bed in California. What's
Right.
going on here?" But if you suddenly like kind of turned your head and found yourself in a jungle, you'd be like, what the hell just happened?"
Yeah.
So that
You would just start screaming.
that continuity that you need in everyday waking life, that that function that the ego performs, is definitely not the same. But there is a version of you, the part of you that allows yourself to awaken and remember. The unconscious dynamic is not fully lost on you. Something's been impressed upon your psyche. So I like to call it dream ego. I see it referred to that as well.
The Drigo.
The Drigo. You can just think of it as a kind of avatar of yourself. It's a little bit different. It's somewhat similar. And I think especially to continue this conversation around lucid dreaming, which is that you're much more aware You're not fully awake. Obviously, you haven't ended the dream, although sometimes that can happen when lucidity really kicks in. But to me, when a dreamer becomes more lucid, the real ego, the active everyday ego, is way more present than the dream ego. And I don't really know what's going on, honestly, in lucid dreaming. But
No,
to
I
me,
mean, no one does.
yeah,
We pretend, especially all of psychology, really.
yeah.
It's all speculation. It's scientific
It's
in some sense.
the best they can do.
Best we can do. We can perform studies, but a lot of these things we're discussing, especially with dreams, it's like we can't really say what's happening or why. We're just sort of like putting forward theories.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to talk about it, but it's never black and white. The idea that the ego is here when you're awake and when you're asleep it's gone, that's very either or.
Yeah.
And it doesn't work that way. It's much more gray than that. There's something more complex than just the notion of like ego here, ego gone.
Right.
It's like, not really. It's not that simple.
Yeah.
Another way that I like to think of lucid dreaming that I think is interesting to think about is if waking life is your unconscious constructing reality all the time, birthing reality, like putting forward what's happening as you pick it up, and the ego is somehow overseeing this construction of reality. The dreamscape is one where reality is being constructed but in a vacuum, and all your senses are absent, all these sensory information is absent. In some sense, the ego is just in a vacuum.
Yeah.
And that the vacuum of memory, even a vacuum of awareness. So the lucid dreaming is tapping into this notion that there's some sort of construction of reality going on.
Yeah.
But the ego, something is pouring in that resembles memory or sensory perception, and the ego is kind of getting more of a grip on what's happening.
Yeah.
Almost trying to like thrust itself out back into the light. Like emerge from unconsciousness.
Yeah.
The ego is trying to poke its head out of the waters of unconsciousness and kind of start breathing again. And then usually quickly just gets sucked under again.
Yeah.
And then you return back to this place of not realizing what's happening.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And I think, I believe in part of that question was asking if you can analyze them similarly. And I think, still definitely, even though there might be a different dynamic in a lucid dream where there are certain elements that are more under your control, things you're shifting. Ultimately, like the playing field and the stage is made up of that unconscious content. And there's a lot that you can do to sort of strip down and look at the layers of your symbolic representations in that. So it's worth still looking into and analyzing.
Do you have a question for us? Do you have a dream you'd like us to analyze? Is there a topic you'd like us to cover?
We want to hear from you. Contact us through the submission form, which can be found at our Instagram page at Golden Shadow Podcast. Or if you're listening on YouTube, you can find the link in the description down below.
Thanks for listening.
See you later.
If you find this podcast useful, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Golden Shadow Podcast. Thank you.